The Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Lamed Gimel Amid Beis discusses the case of Milah. Tana Rabbanan, Hamo, someone is in the process of doing a circumcision. Calls Manshu Osek B'Milah, as long as he's involved in doing the Milah. Chozer ben al sitzin ha'ma'akvin es ha'milah ben al sitzin she'ein ma'akvin es ha'milah. So if you're in the process of Milah, and I guess there's definitely the Milah, the Priya, we could discuss Mitzitza. So one's in the middle of the Milah, so then you could still go back. But if you're in the middle of having breakfast with the bagels and lox already, that's considered the bris is over, and therefore it depends. Peirush, so if you're still doing it, so then you continue, you could do the mitzvah. You could do the mitzvah, but Peirush, but let's say you stopped. So Atzitzin ha'ma'akvin es ha'milah chozer. Of course, if you didn't do the milah, probably you have to go back. But Atzitzin she'ein ma'akvin es ha'milah eino chozer. But this for the extra strands, it's just the issue of hitter mitzvah that you don't have to go back. Uva Rashi Uvatur Kosvu the din zehu rak b'mol b'Shabbos. Ulam kishamol b'meichol chozer afal sitzin she'ein ma'akvin es ha'milah. And however, Rashi and the Torah learned this Gemara is only referring to on Shabbos. That's when you can't go back if you're peirush. But if it's not Shabbos, why not go back? B'shum zeh keli v'im came midin hider mitzvah lagzor l'molam. Rak b'Shabbos ain't hider mitzvah docha Shabbos. But so the way Pashas Rashi and the Torah, that you're going back during the week for hider mitzvah, but on Shabbos apparently hider mitzvah isn't docha Shabbos, and therefore you can't go back. That's the Rashi and so the Rambam in Hilchos Milah, Perek Beis Halacha Vav. Mashakasav Rambam, what the Kesav Mishnah writes from the Rambam, that the Ein Chozer al Tzitzin she'ein ma'akvin es ha'milah. That's what he writes. And then you have Akav Halacha Vav Kasav the Ein Chozer al Tzitzin she'ein ma'akvin b'Shabbos. The Mashakasav because so basically it's a discussion in the Rambam. Basically we assume the Rambam sover af b'chol Eino Chozer al Sitzin she'ein ma'akvin. So it's a machlokas Rashi and the Torah versus the Rambam on whether one has to go back for Sitzin she'ein one after one is peirush, after one stops in the middle of doing something else, whether he has to go back or not for the whether he has to go back for the milah or not. So Rashi says, yeah, why not? Only on Shabbos, not because hider mitzvah is not docha Shabbos. But the Rambam says you don't even go back on Tuesday. So the shaila is, what's pshat in the Rambam? What's the problem with going back? Bishlam on Shabbos, I understand why not to go back, but why would you go back during the week? So v'chasim sova biyar b'shitas harambam t'svirei sha'af b'meicho eino chozer al sitzin she'ein ma'akvin. Why? V'ubishum d'chi perish kvar asel lo lagzor al sitzin she'ein ma'akvin mishum isa chovel b'chaveiro, because there's a prohibition of chavola. Shehu b'lav d'lo yosef v'chein k'shelo perish adayin. If you're still in the middle of the milah, hareish chelak mitzvahs milah shatorah hatira ba'as chavola. Aval k'shaperish ein bazeh ele hider mitzvah bovad ein matir in isra chavala v'chavei mishum hider mitzvah. We don't permit the isra chavala b'chaveiro because of the hider mitzvah. As long as you're involved, you assume you're still involved in the mitzvah itself of milah. But after you're peirush, so then the mitzvah's over. So we don't permit hider mitzvah to be called v'yachavin. The gadol hamol atzmo chozer al sitzin ma'akvin. But a gadol who circumcising himself, he can go back on sitzin she'ein ma'akvin. Kevin sha rosa kayim ba'zeh keli b'anvelo. Perhaps the father doesn't have permission. Lachpo b'no katan. Yotze mimashu ikar mitzvah. maybe the father only could do it if it's Yikra Mitzvah. Therefore, what's the pshat in the Rambam? Why on Tuesday can't you go back for Tzitzin She'ena Ma'akvin? So, because of Chavala. The Beis HaLevi has a different pshat. The Beis HaLevi, Bir B'das HaRambam, the Masha'enu Chose Me'achohu Mishum Dehidda Mitzvah Shayach Lo Marak Bizman Kiyam HaMitzvah Sheteva Ofen Na U'Mehudur. The Beis HaLevi says Hidda Mitzvah only makes sense in the context of the Maisa Mitzvah. Masha'en came B'Milah Kevan Shapirish B'Maisa Milah Hikvar Nigmar Maisa Mitzvah. Then came Kishayakto Akakach Hatzitz Zema Akvin Harehu Misnaya Bali Kiyam Mitzvah. Lokach Sova Ram Ne'eno Makayim Hidda Mitzvah Klal La'achar Shenigmar HaMitzvah. Ve'en Shem Inyan B'Masha Yaktos Hatzitzin Olam HaTor Rashi's related Shayach Makayim Hidda Gam Akagar. So the Beis HaLevi wants to say, what is the Nekudis HaMachlokas between Rashi and Torah versus the Rambam, whether you go back for Sitzin She'eno Ma'akvin during the week? The issue is, what is the nature of the din of Hiddur Mitzvah? Is Hiddur Mitzvah only makes sense if it's a chelak of the Maisa Mitzvah, only if it's part and parcel of the Mitzvah itself? But once you finish the Mitzvah, Hiddur Mitzvah in a vacuum makes no sense? Or no? Hiddur Mitzvah even works independently. So that's what the Beis says. So the Beis HaLevi says the Shita Rambam is Hiddur Mitzvah doesn't make sense on its own, only makes sense in the content of the Maisa Mitzvah. So therefore, it's meaningless to go back on Tuesday and do Sitzah She'ena Ma'akvin. You're not accomplishing anything because Hiddur only makes sense in the context of the Maisa Mitzvah. And here you finished it. Mashenki, Rashi and the source seem to hold the Hiddur makes sense even independently, and therefore you could go back on Tuesday. So that's the yisod of the Beis HaLevi. The Ein Lo Kayim Hiddur Mitzvah La'achar Gemar HaMitzvah. So comes along the Bris Milah and wants to elaborate on the shtickle Torah of the Beis HaLevi. He wants to tie this machlokas. The way the Beis HaLevi explains the machlokas Rambam and Rashi regarding whether you go back, once you perish, whether you go back for Tzitzit She'ena Ma'akvin, is dependent whether Hiddur Mitzvah only makes sense in the context of the Mitzvah or even independently. So he wants to explain as follows. The Rambam Shita is Ben Hilchas Chanukah. The Baal Habayis Madulak near Chanukah Uchol B'nei Habayis. That Baal Habayis lights the near Chanukah for everybody. V'av ha-mahadrin shemalika near l'chol echad ein perusho sheyad l'kol achas b'fnei atzma elo Baal Habayis Yosef near l'chol echad v'kulo chad hadlaka. The Rambam sheet is, let's say if you have 10 people in the house, 8th night of Chanukah, mahadrim and ahadrin according to the Rambam is 80 candles. The Baal Habayis will be busy lighting all 80 candles. Why does the Baal Habayis have to light all 80 candles? Umisham, the sphere away, the Rambam, the Kavan, the Ner, l'chol echad, ve'echad umisham Hiddur Mitzvah, u'achar shehidlek Baal Habayis, v'nigma ma'isa adlaka, shu me'yikar adin, shebein shayach l'kayim Hiddur Mitzvah, achar gmar mitzvah. Umisham kach, so over Rambam, she'Baal Habayis ma'iluk al-kulam, v'kevan shedliko kulam, ma'isa adlaka, achar shay was a Hiddur. So therefore the Rambam is lishitason, consistent with his view that the Hiddur Mitzvah only makes sense in the context of the Maisa Mitzvah. And therefore he points out that only the one who lights the first candle is doing the Mitzvah. Everyone else is doing the Hiddur Mitzvah. Therefore the Baal Habayis has to light all 80, because from 2 to 80 is Hiddur Mitzvah, so you can't do Hiddur Mitzvah in a vacuum. However, a Ramah Kasav, even though there's a machlokas Tosfos in the Rambam, what mahadrim and mahadrim was, Tosfos says it means that if we use the example 8th night of Chanukah, 10 people in your home, Tosfos mahadrim means is 8. Doesn't make a difference how many people. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One menorah in the whole house. And the Rambam disagrees and says you light 80 candles. So the Rama agrees in principle with the Rambam, how you learn the Gemara Mahadrim and Ahadrin, that you'll be lighting 80 candles. But he says everybody lights their own menorah, while the Rambam says the Baal Habayis lights all 80. So what's pshat in the Rama? So that's what we point out. The Rama must be working with Shitas Rashi and the Torah. Ubir agrees later that Rama should be like a Shitas Rashi v'Torah. Shesovrim should be meyachol chozer al sitzin she'ein ma'akles amilu mishum sheshayach lahadir b'mitzvah af la'achar gemar mitzvasa. L'kach yicholen kol echad m'nei habayis lahadlik ner Chanukah l'kayim hider mitzvah af la'achar shenigmar ikar mitzvah v'elakas Baal Habayis. So to summarize, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, Kuf Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, that if you're in the middle of doing the Milah, you go back for both Sitzin HaMa'akvin, Sitzin HaMa'akvin. Pirish, once you stop, you're eating the bagels and lox, so therefore then, if you forgot the Sitzin HaMa'akvin, now you're to the mitzvah of Milah, you got to go back. But if it's a Sitzin HaMa'akvin, you don't have to go back. So what are we talking, what is the Bris referring to? It doesn't spell it out. So Rashi in the Torah learned the Bris is talking about Shabbos, and therefore it makes sense. On Shabbos, Milah is Docha Shabbos, not Hider Mitzvah, and therefore you only could go back for the Sitzin HaMa'akvin, not for the Sitzin HaMa'akvin. However, on Tuesday, one could go back. Wednesday, Thursday, Yimei Achol, one could go back for the Sitzin HaMa'akvin. And the Rambam disagrees and says he learns the Bris Kapshuta. The Bris doesn't mention Shabbos, even though it's in Masechah Shabbos, and therefore it's talking about Ben B'chol, Ben B'Shabbos. Even during the week, you can't go back. So the question is, why not? Why can't I go back? Bishlom on Shabbos, hit the mitzvah, you could argue it's in Docha Shabbos. But the mitzvah is in Docha Shabbos. But during the week, why not? So the Chazon Sofer writes, the Chiddush is, even though you really Milah would be Yasser, because of Chavala being Chaval someone else for Milah, so therefore we only do Chavala if it's the actual mitzvah itself. If it hit the mitzvah, we wouldn't allow Chavala. So that's the Chiddush. The Rambam, that it's Yasser to do even on Tuesday because it's Chavala Shalol Tzarech, or not enough of a Tzarech to be Matir. Hit the mitzvah is enough of a Tzarech to be Matir Chavala, Mechaveiro. But perhaps if a person's doing it himself, so then you can. But the Beis HaLevi takes it totally different. He says it's a machokas in the din of Hider Mitzvah. So the Rambam Shita Hider Mitzvah only makes sense in the context of the Ma'isa Mitzvah. You can't separate the two. And the Rashi and the Torah say no. Hider Mitzvah makes sense in a vacuum. So therefore, the Rambam says it only makes sense in the context of the Ma'isa Mitzvah once you're eating the bagel and lox, that's it. And therefore, you can't go back ever on the Sitzin She'ein Ma'akvin. According to Rashi and the Torah, during the week you can go back. Because they hold, Hider Mitzvah makes sense in a vacuum, it's just not Docha Shabbos. And based on this Machlokas, the Bris Rav wants to say that's the Machlokas, the Rambam and the Ramah. By Mahadrim and Mahadrim, the Rambam says the Baal Habayis lights all 80, the Ramah says each one lights their own. So it's the Rambam with Shitason that hit the mitzvah doesn't make sense only in the context of the Ma'isa mitzvah. So there's only one Ma'isa mitzvah near the Tanur Rabbanan, near the Yishu Beis, or one candle per night, and therefore one goes back and does it. Therefore only the Baal Habayis could do it. And the Rashi says no, the Hider Mitzvah makes sense in the context of the Ma'isa Mitzvah, and that's what the Ramah holds. Therefore, everyone can light their own. Everyone can light their own. Of course, you could argue the Ramah is just saying everyone doesn't have a mind. Maybe everyone is doing their own mitzvah. It's not that they're doing Hider Mitzvah. So that's there's other ways of explaining this Machokes. For us to get into Chovas Habayis, Chobas or Gavra, but that's we'll stop here. But that's in the Kuda regarding the Rambam and Ramah by Mahajim and Menahajim by Ner Chanukah to the issue, the Machlokes Rambam and Rashi in the Torah regarding the issue of Perush, whether you don't go back for Tzitz Jeinam Akvan. Does that mean Afilu B'chol like the Rambam or Rak B'Shabbos like Rashi?